Senators Chris Coons, Amy Klobuchar, and James Lankford talked about President-elect Trump and the incoming Congress at an event hosted by George Washington University. Topics included Mr. Trump's immigration policies, health care, and his cabinet. The panel also takes questions from the audience of college students. This is an hour and 15 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the George Washington University and the Jack Morton Auditorium. Tonight, as with many that have taken place recently in universities, homes, forums, clubs, and places of congregation throughout the United States, tonight is an event of careful reflection on our future with learned guests as we move through the annals of history in the wake of the most recent presidential election. As is the tradition of the George Washington University and our renowned School of Media and Public Affairs, we are the promoters of respectful dialogue and exchange of views on some of the most delicate issues of our time. The Conversation series at SMPA has a long tradition of bringing together some of the leading minds of politics and media to engage in healthy debate to advance our democracy and our civic dialogue. Behind every headline is a story, and behind every story are ideas and actions. As an institution of higher learning, our never-ending quest is to penetrate these elemental levels in search of truth and in search of understanding, the veritable pillars of every democratic society. It gives me great pride as the Dean of the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences at the George Washington University for our institution to host this event tonight because it represents the very fabric of who we are. We are home to the engaged liberal arts, where disciplines intersect and inform each other, where students drink from the well of knowledge. And in the halls of our institutions, students marry the world of theory to the realm of practice as we symbiotically meld the life of the mind with the real world at large. We are the home of value-added education, where we strive to ennoble our students to be citizen leaders, ready to tackle whatever the world may bring, with the highest ethical and moral compass that an education can provide. The grand maestro of this evening's events and of our School of Media and Public Affairs is Frank Sesno. Frank Sesno is the director, again, of the School of Media and Public Affairs here at the George Washington University, and he is a former CNN Washington bureau chief, anchor, and White House correspondent. He's an Emmy award-winning journalist, and he's the creator of planetforward.org, a multimedia project that highlights innovations in sustainability. He is passionate about storytelling, and he is adamant that we need an informed public if we are to have a healthy democracy. It gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight your maestro, Frank Sesno.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. This is quite a crowd. A testament to just how topical this is. Before I bring out our guests for what is going to be, I think, a tremendously fascinating and unbelievably timely conversation, I just want to cover a couple things. First, I want to thank some special people who are here. We are able to have this conversation series and many of the other things we do at the School of Media and Public Affairs and at George Washington University generally because of the generosity and the support and the unwavering friendship of some special people. At the School of Media and Public Affairs, we have our National Council, and our chair, our National Council chair, Shar Beals, is here. Barbara Bradley Haggerty, one of our National Council members, John Lansing, whom I see, Cornell Belcher, I know, is going to try to be here. So to our National Council members and to your support, financial and otherwise, that helps make this event and these sorts of things possible, I want to thank you, and I'd like to ask all of you to join me in thanking our wonderful friends in the front row. Thanks, John. So much of what we're able to do is done because of the generosity and the philanthropy of the people who support us and support you, the students in the room. I also want to thank the College Democrats and College Republicans, both of whom are co-sponsoring this event with us this evening. And they have helped us publicize this and obviously have done a pretty darn good job. So thanks to College Republicans and Democrats. And to our media in the room who join us for this conversation. This is a conversation that's important and we're happy to share. And we hope that others can join in real time, and I'll get to that in just a moment, and we'll be able to watch and learn from. John Perino, Jen Halpin, Chris Genovese, and Betty Saylor are staffers, and Jen is our very special leader here who've helped to make this happen. The hashtag this evening is NowWhatSMPA. So as you're tracking this and tweeting it, please feel free to share it with your social networks, and let's get a little positive conversation going. I'd like now to introduce our remarkable panelists for this evening. Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, and the one and only and GW alumna, Dana Bash, Chief Political Correspondent from GW. So give them all a hand. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. You didn't have anything else to do. You could stop by GW this evening. This is good. Before we start, just so we can get an orientation, how many students are in the room?
Wow.
Okay. And how many of you would consider yourselves politically active or politically aware?
Why would they be at GW?
At GW? That is so weird.
So as we
and
say...
how many of you predicted that the president-elect would be the president-elect?
For the cameras, let the record show, I see about 5 hands.
Okay, good.
So what we're going to do here this evening is talk about where we are, what's changing, how a bipartisan group, Democrat, Republican, are going to interact and govern with a very, very unusual, unprecedented president-elect and president, the role of the media, past and present. And I'm going to invite my wonderful friend and really remarkable journalist, Dana Bash, also to join in the questioning as we go. We'll come to the audience for questions in a bit, so you will have an opportunity as well. Let me start with a very big, broad question to the 3 senators. And that is simply, what do you think it's going to be like? I mean, just on this day, the president-elect is tweeting about flag burning and you should lose your citizenship and maybe go to jail. He's appointed named new nominees to his cabinet who are true to his campaign pledges of wanting to repeal Obamacare and move against certain other things that he talked about on the campaign. But we've never had anybody like this in the presidency.
So Andrew Jackson.
Except Andrew Jackson had served his country before he was president.
Right.
So what do you think? What's the big change going to be?
It's the unpredictable nature of what things are going to be. And I think that is the part that's shaking everyone up, is that no one really knows what to expect other than to expect things are going to be different.
What do you expect?
You know what? I do expect him to follow through on some of the campaign promises, and I expect him to come through on some of the promises and go, "Now we're not going to do that anymore."
Really?
I do, and I think it's just the nature of what we've already seen. For instance, I'm going to prosecute Hillary Clinton. Now he's come through and said, "You know what? I'm going to be magnanimous. We're not going to do that anymore." So there'll be some of those that'll come out. For instance, the trade. He was very passionate about trade issues at the beginning, but throughout the entire campaign, he also said, "I like free trade. I think we should trade." I mean,
he's a businessman after all.
Correct. He's just said we should have better deals. No one knows what the better deals are. But he said we should have better deals, but we should do trade. And so there's a little bit of uncertainty there.
What do you think the big change is going to be?
First, that we're going to have a president who is tweeting himself, unvarnished, immediately, apparently all the time. Not necessarily
Maybe
about...
in the middle of a meeting with you, he will tweet.
Likely. I'm expecting that as we're in the middle of a meeting, if he doesn't like what I say, okay, and then you'll call me up and say, "What do you think about Donald Trump's tweet?" He, during the primaries, during the general election, demonstrated a remarkable ability to literally grab the steering wheel of the bus and shift it suddenly. Totally. And to change the focus of the national conversation at whim. In some ways, that demonstrates the power of social media. Every time there's been a major shift in communications technology, a president emerges who really grasped it and was really able to lead with it. This is our first real social media president. Barack Obama, Our current president was really quite agile and adept at social media, but this is taking it to a new level. What do I think it'll be like? I think the Senate will matter more than it has before. I think that the structure, the fundamentals of our democracy are going to be challenged and strained, and I think the role of media and informed voters is going to be more important than it's ever been.
I'm going to ask you what you think is going to change too, but I do want to make one point that it's important for the audience to know. We have 2 Democrats and 1 Republican here. We tried very hard, and Senator Coons, thank you, and your staff also, to get other people. Calendars are crazed, and we were not able to add to this group, and that's why I'm going to ask Dana to play. No, I'm not. But Senator Klobuchar,
yes.
When you think of the changed landscape and this changed role of the Senate, which you are not of which you are not a majority, what do you anticipate?
Well, I think, first of all, I would agree with my colleagues here that it's going to be an unpredictable time. We don't know exactly what this is going to look like, but what we do know is that the Senate, Democrats in the Senate are going to have power. It's because of the Senate rules.
The Democrats are going to have power.
Yes. We have 48 Democratic votes right now, and Senator McConnell has said he's going to keep in place the Senate rules. At least that's what he said at a dinner that I attended. And so if that is the case, then we have the fact that you need 60 votes on most legislation.
So
there's exceptions for budgets and other things. There's exceptions, of course, for cabinet nominees. There's exception for cabinet nominees for judges, but not for the Supreme Court if that remains the same. We were taking that at a 60-vote margin, and we assume that's what's going to happen with the Republican majority again. So given all that, we do have power, and I think we have to be smart about how we use it. First of all, if there is common ground, I've never won to say simply because you don't agree with someone on a lot of different issues that you don't find that common ground if it's good for the country. Things like infrastructure, we can talk in more in detail about these things, that maybe there will be some agreement and we can move forward. But then I think the main role is the Senate and really the Congress as a whole. It will be to be a check and balance on power. There's a check and balance on the administrative branch, but there's also the check and balance of Democrats in the Senate, because one party will now control the administration, the House, and the Senate. So I think that's going to be a very important role when it comes to trying to say, no, we need some compromises on this legislation, or no, we're not going to reverse this policy and go back decades on whatever the issue is.
We'll come to some of those particulars and where the filibuster and the 60 is going to matter in just a minute. But Dana, you have, as a journalist, you have observed many different administrations. And clearly one of the big differences here is the Twitter president.
Absolutely.
Right? And the once upon a time when the media set the agenda, or so other people thought, has been blown up by a candidate, now a president-elect, who has been uncommonly successful at setting the agenda at 3 in the morning or 7 in the morning. I was on CNN at 6:50, and we were talking about his tweet that had preceded us.
Exactly.
What does that mean?
You know, we don't know. We know what it meant for the campaign, which was, you put it so well and in a very vivid way, which is that he did take the steering wheel and turn it with his Twitter feed. Sometimes he did it to his detriment, and to the point where at the end of his campaign, you remember, his aides successfully somehow took his Twitter away from him, and he won. However, he also understands the power of social media and his Twitter account in particular, and he feels emboldened because he won. And so
it worked.
It worked. Sure, it worked. But campaigning is one thing, as you all know, and governing is quite different. And you know, if he's attacking my colleague Jeff Zeleny for correctly pointing out that Donald Trump's tweet saying that there were 2 million illegal votes cast was not provable and probably not accurate, is okay, that's probably not going to move stock markets. But it is possible that he could wake up one morning and send out a tweet that could shake the global economy, depending on his mood that day. And so I don't know the answer. None of us knows the answer. I actually am wondering, sorry, you're going to get picked on, but the one Republican here what you think. I mean, what would you, if Donald Trump called you on the phone right now and said, how do you think I should handle this Twitter thing? What would you say?
Oh, I would say he needs to have somebody that's by him, so he can say it out loud and say, should I tweet that? And someone say, I would change a couple of words on that, just to clarify. I think there's something.
We call that adult supervision.
I think it's just a person to be next to you, because there is a difference between a candidate and a president.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think he will learn quickly that what he says as president of the United States, the entire world listens to. This is the most powerful office in the world still, bar none. And it can move markets, and it can change the relationship of NATO, and it can change the relationships with people even within our country.
But, yeah. And
so I would just say, it's not a bad thing to continue to communicate. Right. It's not a bad thing because it's very authentic. People know this is really what he's thinking at this moment. But it's also not a bad idea just to be able to say it out loud and have someone else say, let's work on wordsmithing it. That's not unfair. Quite frankly, every press release that goes out from every president wasn't written by the president.
Of course. Yeah.
It was written by someone else.
Yeah.
And then they either ran it past him or ran it past the chief of staff, and the president never even saw it. The spokesman typically speaks for the president. This president didn't hear most of that. It's someone speaking on his behalf. This is this very raw, what's the emotion of the president? That's new.
Let me ask the audience something. How many of you, and answer this honestly, how many of you have felt or are fearful about the incoming president?
Wow.
All right. Again, for the cameras, if you didn't see, and if you're watching on C-SPAN, that was, what would you say, Dana?
A lot.
95%.
Yeah, 90%.
So, senators, this is a serious issue. It's one thing to have political division. We've experienced that in the past when candidates have won and lost. But it's another thing, and I have had students in my office in tears. I have had students tell me that they have been called names that we do not accept as proper, acceptable discourse. It's not about PC, it's about what we do and don't call one another and how we think of one another. How should Donald Trump and the people around Donald Trump handle this now? And how pervasive do you feel this is?
Well, I think there's different reasons for fear, if I could guess this. One is just a breakdown of our politics and what that's going to mean. And I think a lot of that's going to depend, that's in his hands, including on his phone, how he treats people. And remember, he's got a whole government he's going to be running now. And so, as Jim mentioned, you know, you may have people negotiate an agreement for him, and then he tweets something and can undercut them. And I just think there's all kinds of problems that he's going to have to work with the team that he has. The second piece is legitimate security fears, depending on what his policies are. And a president has to make dozens of decisions a day that can affect people's lives, that can affect the world order, and he's going to have to take that very, very seriously. And I think that's why President Obama has been repeatedly meeting with him to convey that message. And the third fear that I've picked up in my own state is just immigrants and people that are concerned about their status. And we have a lot of refugees in my state. We have a big Somali and Hmong population, and I have told them repeatedly, and of course this doesn't apply to everyone in the country, as you have Dreamers and others that are here, but the law is bigger than anyone's tweet. The law is bigger than anyone's rhetoric. And so a lot of this is going to depend, depending on what his actions are, on those of us that are involved in other parts of the government to, as I said, be a check and balance. And I think that's a big part of it. And I would agree with Dana. Unlike the campaign, where it was just kind of everyone went down in a vortex with whatever he said, and then the whole day became that, I am not certain that at least my party going forward is going to be doing that anymore. We're going to have our own agenda focused on the economy and working with Republicans in Congress when we can. And I just think you're going to see a different dynamic.
What's the dynamic going to be in the Senate as a response to this?
My hope is that we will find each other and work together more than we've been able to in recent years. Yes.
Why?
Partly because of the dynamic that Amy points to, which is the filibuster means we're the one piece within Congress where controversial bills that don't necessarily command as broad a support as they might get slowed up or get stopped. And frankly, partly because by structure, by intention, since the founding, we're an institution that has 6-year terms. You know, James just got elected for a 6-year term. We were somewhat joking backstage about the difference between 2-year terms and 6-year terms. Part of our structural role is to be small enough and serving long enough that we actually get to know each other. All 3 of us are active members in the prayer breakfast, which is something that happens every Wednesday. We're in session, where folks from a broad range of religious and political and regional backgrounds get together for an hour. There's nobody there but senators and our chaplain. And we really get to learn a lot about each other. I think it's a very powerful experience. It is, I think, possible for us to agree as senators that we want to focus on infrastructure, on manufacturing, on supporting our veterans, on things that we can agree will strengthen our country, and that we want to tamp down or downplay or marginalize the sort of jerking the wheel back and forth effect it has on our constituents of a nation that seems to be led merely by whim and tweet. I do think that the gravity of the job is beginning to sink in with President-elect Trump. I think the conversations he's had in intelligence briefings and with President Obama are...
What makes you say that?
The tempo of the tweeting and its focus changed quite a bit after the night of the election. Look, I'm choosing to be an optimist here, okay?
You have like 3 very civil people up here, and I'm
we have
just
3 very civil
these
people here. This is the beginning of
the tempo of the tweeting.
the tempo of the tweeting. Look, I choose to be hopeful based on the tenor that Trump struck in his victory speech, where he focused on veterans and infrastructure, period. And I choose to be optimistic about the number of his more outrageous, outlandish, or offensive proposals from the campaign that he has already stepped back from. I have no illusion that I'm going to agree with many of his cabinet nominees, with his agenda or his priorities, but to the point just made a few minutes ago that 90% of this audience is genuinely scared of him as president. I think a number of the more outlandish things said in the campaign are going to be put aside, partly by senators working together to say, hang on a minute, we're not going to suddenly have a bromance with Putin and set aside decades of alliance with NATO. We're not going to ignore the illegal annexation of Crimea and
John
occupation
McCain
of
and Lindsey
Ukraine.
Graham have already sent signals on that score as well.
They've been very forceful in that communication.
And that's another factor, which is a number of Republicans who on various issues, whether it is Mike Lee and Rand Paul on some of the civil liberties issues, whether it is John McCain and Lindsey Graham on Russia, whether it is Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and Jeff Flake and others that have taken more moderate positions on various issues. I think that will be a factor as well. That's going to be a big deal there.
I just wanted to add to what you were saying about trying to make the 90% of the people in here who raised their hands saying that they were fearful. Look, this was definitely a shock to the system, but it's not, a shock to the system is not necessarily a bad thing. As somebody who has covered you all and, genuinely believe that these individuals are phenomenal public servants to a person. They're phenomenal public servants in a system that has been broken. Voters got that. They got it. Mm-hmm. It hasn't worked. It's the gridlock. There's so much blame to go around, and it's unclear if this solution is going to work, but voters wanted a disruption, and they got it. And I actually think that there is reason to be optimistic that, people like this, and as long as those of us in the media, hold their feet to the fire, can find common ground, whether it's on infrastructure or fixing. I mean, the Republicans, you guys have different points of view with the president-elect on how to deal with entitlements, but you got to deal with them because you guys are not going to have them probably unless they're dealt with.
But see, here's the big issue is that we're not in a dictatorship that has a single leader that defines everything. It's always been the offensive thing for me to hear people say, and I've heard it for a long time, people saying the president's the CEO of the country. Like, no, he's not. He's the leader of a co-equal branch of 3 branches. He leads the executive branch. There's a legislative branch and a judicial branch. And the perception that's risen, and it's risen for the past couple of decades, that somehow the president is the leader of all government is not true. He's the co-equal leader in many ways. And it's been fascinating to me the week after the election, and I chair the subcommittee on regulatory affairs. And so I work not just with writing the regulation, but the process of how regulations come together. There's a legal process called the Administrative Procedures Act, and there's a lot of statute and how regulations come about. I would tell you in my committee, I worked very hard for the last 2 years to be able to build coalitions and to say, we have real problems with how regulations are coming out, the speed, the frequency, the way that they're coming out, how many are being overturned in the court. There's a problem with regulations and what's happening right now. And my Democratic colleagues wouldn't get on board. And I kept saying to them in a presidential election, if there's a President Trump, you're going to want to have good boundaries on how regulations are done. And so help me, a week after the election, Democratic members are calling me and saying, let's work on regulatory reform.
The lame duck.
And as soon as possible, let's work on regulatory reform. And I've smiled at them and said, I'm still willing to work on this because regardless of whether it's a Republican or Democrat in the president, that's a co-equal branch that needs to have boundaries, just like everyone else does. And Americans, I would tell you, and I agree with Dana on this, for those of you that are scared of a President Trump, this is America responding to a sense of frustration to a budget process that doesn't work and hasn't worked since 1974. There's been 4 times since 1974 the budget process has worked. 4 times in that time period. This is a frustration of people feeling like they're not being heard in key areas and not having engagement. And I would tell you with most elections, the electorate, when they look for who they're going to vote for, either look for arsonists or carpenters. These 3 folks here are all carpenters. President-elect Trump is an arsonist. He's going to walk in and say, this all needs to change immediately.
It's interesting you say that because I have said for a long time, if you want to burn down the house, you hire the arsonist.
Right.
And that's exactly what just happened.
Right. But that's a response to the American people, but there's still a White House, there's still a House, and a Senate, and a judicial branch. None of that has changed.
I'm just looking as a former prosecutor that prosecuted arson cases. I just can't go there with you. I can go with the gangs
Don't go to the
sometimes.
illustration yet.
All right, okay.
But we're also talking with 3 senators here, and the Senate is a deliberative body, and the deliberative body is designed to slow things down. But there are plenty of things.
We do that well.
You do that really well. But there are plenty of things that a President
Really
Trump
saucer.
can do very quickly, and some of the fears I know that have been expressed relate to, for example, climate change. A candidate who called it a hoax, who has turned to his transition team, is led by someone who is essentially a climate denier. The person who he's turning to for the Department of Transportation believes in revving up the coal plants again and digging. And that may all be good for those areas and produce jobs, but for those who think that climate is a big issue, it shows that the president can move quickly and can make rapid change. What's your response to that?
I remain actually optimistic that the economy has moved in a way that even if a new Secretary of Transportation, a new president, wants to dramatically revive coal production in the United States, most of the closing of coal-fired power plants has happened because of fuel switching to natural gas. We have abundant natural gas because of fracking in this country. I don't think we're going to see a significant resurgence of coal mining and production and burning in the United States, but we'll see. So I frankly think there's been more reduction in greenhouse gases because of fuel switching than there has been because of regulatory impact on coal production and output. Hopefully, one thing that could happen is a new administration might really invest in carbon capture and sequestration and in the technology that could make coal less dirty and more sustainable. But bluntly, the private sector in the United States has overwhelmingly accepted the idea that climate change is real, that people cause it, that it's going to have meaningful consequences.
Say what happens in Washington doesn't matter?
What happens in Washington will have less of a negative impact, given that virtually every major Fortune 500 company says, we've already invested in making some of these changes. Our regulatory agenda matters, and what the EPA does matters, but I'm trying to note some small reasons to be less depressed for this audience.
But also the Paris climate change agreement matters with the rest of the world.
He said that he's not going to get rid of.
When he talked to Obama, did he then say this is like me
he
trying to
told the New
figure
York
out
Times.
Cuba with him.
He suggested, he didn't come flat out and say it, I don't think.
He suggested to the New York Times that
He would reverse himself and not change it.
And that he might not change
Correct,
that.
yeah.
But I just say, and I agree with Chris that there's a lot of action in the private sector, and we also have companies in my state like Cargill and others that are very supportive, General Mills, of moving forward on reducing greenhouse gases. So there's also major businesses that see this as an issue for them going forward, especially international businesses. But that gets to the international issue, is if he were to step back from the agreements that we've made with other countries, which does have an impact to me, if we start putting pressure on other countries, they agree to do it. If we just walk away from that, I think that would be that would not be good for the future here.
Because we have so many politically engaged people in the room and history majors, I can make reference to Nixon goes to China. Could Trump be Nixon goes to China on the issue of immigration?
Yes. And I've said that to people already.
Explain that.
I absolutely agree this will be a situation that will be Nixon goes to China. If you go back to the earliest years of the Obama administration, when all the promises were made, we're going to do immigration issues, and then it didn't happen, and then the work that the Senate did, I wasn't there at the time, on immigration was not matched by the work of the House and was not matched by the actions of the
Senate did its job.
Was not matched by the House, was not matched by the White House in trying to engage and to be able to bring a real agreement together. You've got to get all three parties to be able to do that. This is a situation where Trump could stand up and say, he has the bully pulpit and say, immigration's a problem. And where he has been effective is to stand up and say, this is a problem. And he gets criticized by saying, when someone says, okay, tell me what the solution is. And his solution is, I'm going to hire good people. That is a CEO mentality that says, I don't have to fix that. I have to find good people that can fix that. I just know that's a problem, and we need to commit resources to it. If he does that on immigration, we'll settle the immigration issue.
I want to put on my Chris Coons optimistic hat. I have wondered this because the Senate immigration bill, this was one Marco Rubio and many others were involved. I'm on the Judiciary Committee, actually contained hundreds of millions of dollars for security at the border. It did not mandate a wall across the whole border, and he's been backing away from that. It was going to be a combination of personnel and fencing, but of course it had a path to citizenship, and it had
gold door.
A number of other things.
The gold door.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the point is, I have thought in my most pleasant moments that maybe there is a chance to move forward given the strong support we had in the Senate for a bipartisan bill. But yes, we would, and there were other compromises that were brought up in the last bill. But the point is that that's going to be a leap now with the base that has been behind him in the campaign, and also the immigrant community, which is not going to be very trusting of this. And so this would be a major effort if he wanted to do this, and it would be, there's clearly people in Congress that want to work on it, but I can tell you on the Democratic side, it has to be a combination of not just order at the border, but also some kind of path to citizenship, documented work, or something that works for the people that are here that would qualify for that kind of status.
Frank, can I just give a formula real quick? I know everybody has insight on this one as well. There's been an ongoing conversation about how do we do compromise in Congress and how do we handle this. And the lock on this has been that everybody's got to take parts that they really hate and put it together. And so we've just been in this gridlock. There is a way to be able to approach this and say, let's look for the common ground, what Amy's talking about before, excuse me, Senator Klobuchar.
No, it's a good
idea. So what we...
for building relationships, first names.
Yeah, okay. So we already have the relationship, so that's okay. So the issue is, if you look at it and say, I really like A and B, I think A and B are a good idea. Amy thinks B and C are a good idea, and she really hates A. And by the way, I really hate C. At some point, we can say to compromise, you got to do a little bit of A that she hates and a little bit of C that we hate, that I hate, and that works it out. But you're stuck if you try to do it that way. It is easier to get unstuck if we say we both like B, let's move on what we agree on. And let's stop just staring at each other and fighting over A and C, and let's get moving again. Because part of the challenge that we have is everyone's trying to say, you've got to do a little bit that you hate, and so we're doing nothing.
But it's easy to talk about that when it's A, B, and C.
Right.
It's harder to talk about when it's Obamacare, and it's a question of, are you going to be required to have health coverage? And if you're not, are you going to be fined? Right. Is the federal government telling you to do that? And what's the A and the B and the C? And what? So let's take that for a minute. okay? Because that was a specific and deeply held position of the candidate Trump throughout, right? Mm-hmm. You interviewed him.
You're talking about repealing Obamacare?
Repealing Obamacare.
No question.
You interviewed him how many times? Several times. Right?
Yeah, I mean, 5 or 6, and then not including the debates.
And you talked to him about Obamacare, among other things.
Yes, I actually asked him questions during the debate about Obamacare.
And
well, not just Obamacare, but more importantly, what he would put in place.
And what do you see taking place now?
I see that he's going to rely a lot on you guys.
Yep.
I mean, truthfully.
Exactly.
Yeah, maybe not these guys, but you. Because, I mean, I just remember very, very clearly in one of the debates during the Republican primary, my line of questioning was about what would you replace Obamacare with? And his first answer was, I'm just going to do away with the lines around, he does this, the lines around the states, and which is, of course, a very kind of core Republican ideal that you allow more insurance to be sold across state lines, right? And then I said, well, what else? And he's like, I said, do you have anything else? He said, no. Nope. I mean, literally, he didn't. And of course, again, this is just one example of how any of you, no offense, it would have been like lights out. Like, that's it. You don't have a health care plan, but it didn't really matter. The flip side of that and the positive side of that for you guys is that, well, now he's put Price in, which is a horror show for the Democrats, but he actually is somebody who has some plans. Yep. Has some plans, and he's done this, and he's come up with ideas and written it into legislative language and so forth.
And as a doctor.
And as a doctor. So I think Obamacare is a perfect example of how he's got a big idea about what he wants done, but he's going to be very okay with allowing a lot of people to fill in the blanks.
This is a really interesting, this thing on healthcare is really interesting. I pulled Tom Price's piece that he wrote for Politico on the 30th of July, 2009, which was the 45th anniversary of Medicare. And this is a really interesting example, actually, and I'm looking at my friend Bob Entman here in terms of bias, media bias. So all the reporting that I have seen today talks about conservative, anti-Obamacare Tom Price, and how he has this quote about how Medicare was the worst thing that, having government in Medicare is the worst thing to happen to healthcare. But if you go back and you read the entire paragraph, here's what it says. As a physician, I can attest that nothing has had a greater negative effect on the delivery of health care than the federal government's intrusion into medicine through Medicare. That's what I see quoted every place. Sure. Because of Washington's one-size-fits-all approach, its flawed coverage rules, broken financing mechanisms, seniors are increasingly having care rationed while federal health spending spirals out of control. And earlier in the piece, he made reference to insurance companies, too, as this third-party decider. Talk to a senior citizen about Medicare. Talk to a senior citizen about doctors who aren't taking Medicare patients anymore, or the concierge service they have to buy. And maybe Medicare really is broken. Maybe they're really right.
Well, I mean, when you look at Medicare itself, it has actually been one of the best things that's happened for the seniors in our country. When you look at their status, what their life was like before it and what it's like now, and there's a reason that they want it to stay. And do we look at reforms? Yes, I've been a long-time advocate for a better delivery system reform. I don't actually think we did enough in the Affordable Care Act, being from a state that has always had high-quality care, and seeing the money go down in one big transfusion tube to states that are less organized in their health care and charge Medicare rates that are much higher than what we do in some states. That's not right. It's called geographic de-averaging. So I've been an advocate for some reform. But at the same time, when you look at the need to make changes to the Affordable Care Act, I think you have to look at what's going to work, and you can't make the changes in one day. You've got the benefits that people want, staying on the health, I'm not going to, staying on your parents' insurance till you're 26, the donut hole that was closed, the pre-existing conditions. And then when I start looking at one by one changes I'd like to see, clearly some changes to the way those individual exchanges work. Clearly some changes to pharmaceutical, which no one in the Senate ever wants to take on. But it's huge. It's 20% of our health care costs now when you include hospitals. Senator McCain and I have a bill to bring in less expensive reimportation drugs from Canada. Senator Grassley and I have a bill that we're doing together to stop pay for delay, where Big Pharma pays off generics to keep the competition off the market. Look at what happened with EpiPen. That was just one example. The top 10 drugs in this country, 4 of them have gone up 100% in their price to consumers. Insulin's gone up 3 times. Naloxone that you use for opiate overdoses have gone up 1,000%. So do I want reform? Yes. I always said from the day we passed that bill, it was a beginning and not an end. So it is more than just Medicare. It is stepping back and looking at this. And I was really hopeful that we could do a reform bill and make changes, but not if the whole discussion is going to be, let's just throw this out and just we'll figure out what we're going to do later. That is not going to work for the American people.
I worked hard in the last Congress to introduce and to work on 5 different bills that were modest reforms to the Affordable Care Act. I'll never forget, there was a new Republican senator who's a physician from Louisiana, was presiding over the Senate, and I came to the floor to give a speech about Obamacare. This was about 2 years ago, 18 months ago. And the first half of the speech was 3 stories about 3 Delawareans whose lives have been saved by the access to affordable health care that they got through the Affordable Care Act. And the other 3 stories were Delawareans I've met with who are small business owners, contractors, or physicians, where the increase in rates and costs have really hurt them, hurt their business, caused them to drop coverage, caused them to stop providing certain care. And he was, sort of writing away during the first 3 stories. And when he heard me tell the next 3 stories, his head came up, sort of looks at me, brings me, and he said, "You're a Democrat, aren't you?" I'm like, "Yes, I am." He said, "And you just spent 15 minutes talking about the flaws of Obamacare." I said, "Yep." He was genuinely surprised. He didn't realize there were Democrats who thought it was anything other than perfect. I wasn't part of the Senate when it was passed, but I think there's many in our caucus who recognize that it wasn't written by God, it was written by humans, and it has flaws. The challenge here is, compared to what? If you simply follow the path that the House Republican majority has and repeal it, just wipe it out and repeal it, without any work together to find something that can achieve some of the same goals in terms of coverage and quality and cost reduction, I think then Republicans will rue the day, because 2 to 4 years later, there will be a very negative consequence. On the other hand, one of the core principles of Republicanism has been federalism, respect for states and their ability to reach their own conclusions. My hope is that one of the things on the table will be that those states that have really embraced the Affordable Care Act and have put in place exchanges that work and have really invested in it will have the option to retain much of the structure and rules that exist today. And those that have utterly rejected it and say this is something we don't think works for our state have an alternative path towards achieving the same goals, but with market mechanisms and less government-driven mechanisms.
I reached out to a friend of mine who's a player in the healthcare forum, and I said, "What do you think I should ask?" And he says, "Ask the Republicans, given the promises made to repeal the Affordable Care Act, are you committed to ensure that the 21 million Americans provided coverage under the law will continue to be covered?" How do you answer that?
Yeah, I would tell you that it is one of the conversations that we have. When Obamacare was put in place, there were many people that had state-based coverage or other coverages that lost their coverage. They had to get new doctors. They had to go through new testing again. They had to do a new shift. And we don't want to see that again. Those folks are diabetics or cancer patients. It was a very, very hard time for those individuals to transition. So these people who are covered will
continue to be covered?
The hope is to be able to have that, to be able to basically do a hold harmless, to say freeze with what you have on that, and then help with a transition. So you're really looking at a 2-stage, where it's both a bridge and a transition. Let me make a couple of comments on this. One, going back to your comment about just the bias and about Tom Price. That is the focus right now for every person that Trump puts out. Immediately, the first story is, not from Dana, of course, but immediately the first story is how horrible they are. We reached back to 1973 in a comment they made at a college meeting, and they said this. So they're a terrible racist, and they're an awful human being, and they hate all people, period. They don't like any human beings. And so what I get people coming to me is saying, oh my gosh, these people they're selecting, these are horrible individuals. Where do you find these? Instead of backing up and looking at people and saying, let's look at the whole of what they're doing, and let's give them the opportunity to be able to walk through the process. That's one of the things now, and I think there are people that are frustrated and upset. They lost the election. They didn't wish it'd go this way. And so I don't like him, and so I probably don't like anybody that he likes. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, I'm catching people saying, you're doing to him what you said you don't like he did to you. How do we fix that? Mm-hmm. because that's a modeling issue, and that's
What's
a
the
shift
answer
that has
to
to
that?
occur.
How do you fix that?
Well, I think that's somewhat the modeling that we do. I think that's the modeling that each individual does. I'm amazed at the number of people that don't like the caustic nature of his tweets or what happens on social media, but if you read their tweets, holy cow. Trump's are G-rated compared to some of the stuff that I see that other people put out there, and how caustic and angry that really things have become on social media. So I try to ask folks to say, why don't you look at your own stuff, and to be able to evaluate what we're doing and the example we're setting for the next generation. On the healthcare issue, the straw man that's been put up continually are that Democrats want to take care of all people and Republicans want to put people on the street. That's not true, and everyone knows it. It is two different sets of solutions. To go back to what Chris was saying, there is a passion to say, how can states solve some of these issues? States are closer. You realize in the past 5 years, Medicaid has one of the highest improper payment rates of all government, $142 billion in improper payments in just Medicaid. That's a state-run program that the federal government is trying to manage and can't keep up with. If you move to states being able to organize and to be able to do more, they're more engaged. That regulator in Oklahoma that's overseeing just under 4 million people, when there's fraud, they're down the street and we can check on it. It's 1,200 miles from here. And so when you're managing fraud, when you're managing relationships, when you've got a bad doctor, when you've got a bad hospital, they know about it in the state because they're down the road.
So
there's a greater role.
Block granting. This is one of the ideas of
there are
Medicaid.
multiple options, but there should be more ability to be able to monitor and to be able to control that on a state level. I don't have the belief that only people that are in Washington, D.C. love Americans. I kind of think that there are state leaders that also love the people in their state and want to care for what's happening in their state as well.
What's your response to that and to this kind of the way we portray this? Because, and Dana, this also touches on a media thing, and in about 5 minutes we'll go to audience questions. There's so much we're not going to get to here, but I mean, the way a lot of this is portrayed through the media, including CNN, my alma mater, the place you work, certainly a lot of talk radio, whether it's Rush Limbaugh or Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, is through the ideological prism. And it's not as gentlemanly and womanly as this conversation here. And it doesn't focus on compromise and consensus. It focuses on conflict and headbutting.
That's right. And so one of the things that has at times frustrated me in my service here in the last 6 years is that I'll get asked if I'm available for a show. I'll get sort of tentatively booked, and then I'll get bumped for somebody who's more of a bomb thrower or more willing to take a fight, more willing to throw a punch. So
You're smiling and nodding.
Yeah, or a paid person who will do it and pretend they're not paid.
So if it didn't matter in our line of work whether we were ever on the Sunday shows or the cable shows, it'd be easy to just ignore it and say it doesn't really matter. But on some level, our visibility to our constituents, to our friends and supporters nationally, depends on how often we're on the shows that they're interested in.
And just moving
So
the ideas.
there is a sort of feedback loop. I'll give you a quick example to get back to your point about nominees. Senator Sessions has been nominated to be our next Attorney General. And I've done a series of interviews now already. And one of the things I did immediately was to put out a statement, and then I've said this in a couple of interviews, and I told Jeff directly I was going to do this. I give him credit for two things that we worked on well together that I did not expect he would be a good partner on. When the Federal Public Defender Service got absolutely slashed, savaged by the sequester. Now he's a real law and order guy and a former federal prosecutor. He joined with me to make sure that funding got restored for the public defender system. I should have understood that as a principled prosecutor, he understands if the defendant doesn't have a good lawyer, the odds you're going to get a bad conviction and it'll get overturned on appeal are higher. But I didn't naturally grasp that. And it was a good relationship building exercise for us. Second, when the Obama administration cut funding for Victims of Child Abuse Act, Senator Sessions worked with me to get the funding restored and to get it reauthorized. In 6 years, those are the two things we've worked well together on. There's a lot of other things I suspect I will disagree with him on civil liberties, on civil rights, on other issues.
And do you hold him accountable to that statement that he made, apparently in defense of or in soft peddling the Ku Klux Klan that I think you made reference to from decades ago?
I've promised him I will keep an open mind. We will have a full and fair hearing. What Merrick Garland didn't get, I think we owe him and every other nominee, which is a several-day-long full hearing. I am less concerned about statements from decades ago than I am things he has done recently in the Senate as a legislator, but I'm going to look at the whole record. And ultimately, whether I'll support him or not, I haven't made up my mind yet, and I don't think I should have made up my mind
Any
yet.
decisions the president-elect has made with respect to cabinet that you have made up your mind on?
I am waiting eagerly to see who he will nominate for Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense.
And what if it's Corker?
Senator Corker was actually the first senator with whom I traveled overseas.
Yeah.
As I think we've discussed before, a fascinating trip. Joe Manchin, Bernie Sanders, Bob Corker, and me.
A merry band of warriors.
If there'd been a camera crew in the back of that C-130 bouncing around from Pakistan to Afghanistan, we had some fascinating conversations. I knew Senator Corker least of the other three before we went, and I came back with a real respect for him because he was a mayor. I think he and President-elect Trump might get along very well because they've both got a background in development and construction. He is a very conservative Republican. We do not agree on a lot of issues. But I find he is someone who is earnest, honest, fair, and he has managed the committee well. To me, those would recommend him pretty highly.
Rudy Giuliani?
That would be a harder sled for me.
Should ask him about Rudy Giuliani.
Rudy Giuliani?
You know what? I don't know Rudy, but I'm not afraid of Rudy. Only because of what I saw him do in his leadership in New York City. He was fair, he was law and order, but he was fair, he engaged with all people in all parts of the community and was very passionate about helping the whole city when he was there.
You convinced?
I'm just very concerned about some of the comments that he's made during the campaign. And like Chris, I'm going to look at each nominee on their merits. I think that's very important. I did that when Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan were nominated to the Supreme Court. I think that's what you do. That's your job as a senator.
Any name out there you'd oppose right now?
For the Supreme Court? Chris Coons.
You'd oppose it? No, for this cabinet that's emerging.
Well, I'm going to just see who he brings in. So,
Dana, let me let you ask a question of the senators you've covered so closely before we go to the audience. Where would you like to hear them?
Oh boy. I'll start with you. I think, Senator, you are obviously, a conservative and from a very red state.
That's why I have red hair.
Which exactly, I was just going to say that. But you, where do you think that you talked about the prayer breakfast and so forth. Where do you think that you as a Republican, along with Democrats, along with President Trump, can actually get things done?
Well, I think there's a lot of areas.
What's the first thing in real terms and practically, the first thing that you think that you could move through Congress, get to his desk that he could sign that would make everybody go, oh, okay, maybe things are working now?
Well, that's a tough one to try to think of the first thing because there's so many priorities for what's the first thing and how things are going to operate. Yeah. I did mention regulatory issues before about trying to figure out how we actually function again and how we get a good balance of power.
And it's important, but no offense, it's not so sexy.
I know. I jokingly say I chair the nerdiest committee in D.C. Just managing that.
The antitrust.
Yeah, okay.
Now that is
going to be really interesting.
We have several students here who aspire to your job. They're very studying it.
That issue is a big issue. Yeah. I do think we'll find more common ground on immigration than everyone wants to admit at this point. And I think if people are willing to drop A and B, or A and C, and to be able to focus on the common ground, I think we'll be able to move on things. And we have for decades now done nothing on immigration, and there are major problems that are there that we need to address. And so I think if we can focus on the common ground areas and not have to fight about the A and C areas, I think we're going to do okay on that.
And if he called you tomorrow and said, Amy, I want to work on something with you, what do you think we can actually get done?
I would say infrastructure, just because I think it's the best bet. By the way, if he called me tomorrow, I would say don't step back on what Obama has done on Cuba. That would be the first thing I'd say. I'm leading that bill to lift the embargo, and I'm very concerned if we start moving backwards.
That would be the first thing you'd say?
Yes, I would. I would just say it. But then I would go.
What would you say?
The first thing I would say? Probably hello, but yeah.
Okay. Oh, God, really? Okay. So I to finish answering Dana's question, the thing that I think has the most potential, based on partly what Chris said, is that he raised it the first night, is infrastructure. I live 8 blocks from that bridge that fell down in the middle of a summer day in Minneapolis. 35W bridge, not just a bridge, it's a highway. And 13 people died, and I will never forget that. And if he's willing to finance a major infrastructure development in this country, we've already passed the FAST Act, which was led by Senator McConnell and Senator Boxer. And so we have baseline funding already. So it's not like we're just making up for things. We actually could have a chance to do something on perhaps broadband and roads and bridges and you name it, wastewater treatment plants. And you talk about a rural agenda as a state that's a pretty rural state. I think that would be a big step if we started working on that. How we pay for it, there is some interest in overseas money, trillions of dollars that are overseas. Senator Schumer, our leader, has been devoted to this for a long time, and I am as well, and that is finding some way to bring that money back from overseas. It won't be, I will say it will be a bit controversial on our side, but finding a way to bring the money back, and then what you could do is if companies voluntarily bring the money back with a rate that we have enough votes to pass, you could then, as part of the deal, have a certain percentage of it go into either an infrastructure financing authority. I don't call it an infrastructure bank because that creates problems on your side with some people. So infrastructure financing authority or straight into the highway fund. So that could be a big
I think you should take some more time and think about it.
What? Oh, so
She's done. Boom, boom, boom.
You know what?
Done.
Okay, but he probably wouldn't listen that long to me on the
He
phone.
might.
Because I don't think that's how I just put it out there now because maybe one of the advisors is watching C-SPAN. And so I think
maybe
that
the president-elect is. No, he doesn't watch C-SPAN. I don't think he does.
And Senator, you obviously, your passion and your main portfolio is national security, international policy. So, and he's, look, as Republicans go, he's not so hawkish.
He isn't. I would talk to him about manufacturing first. I've led, along with Senator Baldwin, an initiative in my caucus that's called Manufacturing for America. And we've put together 25 bills that are on a wide range of issues: tax, trade, immigration, intellectual property, skills for the workforce, that are all around how to strengthen and sustain the growth in manufacturing. We have had 900,000 new jobs in manufacturing added over the last 5 years. We are actually winning again, to borrow his phrase, at manufacturing, and there are things that we can do to accelerate the trend and to move in the right direction. We can increase, I think, both employment and productivity. And this is an area that puts people to work without four-year university degrees. It allows folks of a wide range of backgrounds and skills and education to have a decent life and a high wage and good value, good benefits. So I think fighting for manufacturing would be the first thing I'd talk to him about. Yes, I'd also talk to him about Russia, the Middle East, Africa, NATO, but he would have hung up on me after the first time.
I'm going to invite students or anybody else to make your way to the microphone, and we'll open it up for questions. While you're doing that, Dana, what does the media need to change?
Oh, nothing. We're perfect.
I thought that would be a short response.
Where do I start? I mean, look, it's, we always have to, I think, we always have to be, put ourselves under the microscope, and I want to let them get their questions, but and be reflective, especially in this new world where you have a president tweeting, and the inclination is to, you know, to sort of follow the shiny red object, and the inclination is also, and I think you guys are right, conflict is good TV, but sometimes it's not just about conflict, it is about compromise. And I think working harder on that, especially in today's day and age, is important.
Really important. All right, we're going to go to your questions. If you can keep them short and you can keep your answers relatively succinct, we'll get as many in as we can. I know we have to let you go because you've got an interview at 7:15, and you got to go too. You're on.
Go fast.
Really quickly, first, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm just really curious in general with an unprecedented election cycle and now quite an unprecedented moving forward with the new president-elect. A lot of people have been talking about the future of elections and the Electoral College and things within the United States and political parties and divides. And I was wondering if you guys had any opinions or ideas about the future of these things. And this, I know a lot of people have heard the conversation.
Okay, well, I would, first of all, make it easier for people to vote in a lot of states, not harder. The voting rights reauthorizing that would be good. Electoral college, it turns out that, in fact, despite what Donald Trump may have said on his tweets, Hillary Clinton didn't win the popular vote. And so I think that's worth looking at. I know that'll be very difficult. The one thing, if I could do one thing, it's the campaign finance side. My new perch is the ranking member of rules. We have some jurisdiction over that. I'm going to focus on it. The Citizens United decision has brought in so much of this outside money that candidates no longer control their own message or what they're doing. And the money that we raise, which at least is all reported, is dwarfed by what comes in major campaigns from the outside. And I think it's very damaging to our democracy.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you.
Good evening. So I was wondering, with the way the president-elect looks at foreign policy as a zero-sum game, as you said, with winning and losing only, and how foreign policy has become more unilaterally focused with action from the president in recent history, what do you think the Senate can do to try and wrestle back some of that power from the president, as it looks like the president-elect will not be diplomatic in any way? Thank you.
I don't know that he won't be diplomatic in any way. I will be nervous at the first state dinner. I'll say that because he is so informal in how he speaks, and he's not careful sometimes in how he does it. I think that's part of it sinking in that he's the president of the United States and everything that he says matters. But he is a very smart businessman, and he does know how to be able to move issues, and he has traveled around the world. His passion, though, for America to be first is not a bad position. Quite frankly, the world benefits with a strong America. As we continue to strengthen, the world continues to strengthen on it. We're still a quarter of the world's economy. If our economy continues to struggle, the world economy continues to struggle. So there's really both and here. I don't think he's walking away from NATO. I just don't think he does. But quite frankly, NATO has not lived up to its military obligations. They never have. Not a country but us in the NATO alliance has kept their end of the bargain to be able to maintain what is required to be able to stay in the NATO alliance. So if pressure was put on those other countries to say, we want to keep an alliance, but you have to actually live up to your end of the bargain, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And so while we don't know somewhat, and we'll know more after he picks a Secretary of State, exactly what direction that he wants to go in foreign policy, I'm not all that concerned about that.
Your turn.
Briefly, I've got an article that just went up in Democracy that lays out 5 areas where I think the Senate, on a bipartisan basis, can and should make a real difference in the conduct of foreign policy. I'll disagree that there's never been a NATO country that's met the spending goals or the military commitment. We've been disappointed in several of our largest NATO allies. That may be one positive outcome that comes of his, I think, somewhat reckless statements. It may scare the daylights out of our NATO allies, and they may step up and invest more. That would not be altogether bad. I'll briefly say, we really have not lived up to our constitutional role to declare wars. We are now conducting conflicts in a half dozen countries based on the 2001 and 2002 authorizations of the use of military force. They have been stretched beyond all recognition from their original scope. We should, on a bipartisan basis, take a hard look at what we're authorizing the president to do, in what geographies, to what purpose, to what time, and work in a bipartisan way to authorize the wars that we are conducting today, and do it in a way that doesn't have the leaking and ungoverned edges of the current AOMS.
Next question. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for being here. My question's for Senator Lankford. This morning, Senator McCain, in discussion with reporters, I think kind of exasperated, said, I don't want any more questions about the president-elect, and that's my right as a senator. So I guess my question is in 2 parts. The first part is, do you think that is your right as a senator? And second of all, what's your advice to your Republican congressional colleagues in fielding questions about the president-elect?
Are you a student here?
I am.
Do we have the best students on? That's a great question.
It's a great question. Let me clarify it from my position on it. We have on the Senate Republican side, we have what we affectionately call the gauntlet that we walk through, and have renamed it the Trump gauntlet when we head to a meeting, because there's a line of reporters that line up the hallway and try to stop us and catch us and ask us a question about something Trump said 10 minutes ago that they want to be the first one to ask us when we haven't heard the whole context of it, and say, Trump just said this, what do you think? Okay? I respond to reporters, I'm not Trump's spokesman. I'm just not, and I'm not trying to negate that. If you want to know what Trump meant by something, ask his spokesperson. Because my responsibility is to be able to speak from my state and what I believe as a senator, not have to speak for John McCain and what he says, or not have to speak for the president-elect and what he says, or the House members, or goodness knows, Chris Coons. You know, so I don't speak well for them. Now, I may have opinions on one thing or the other, but it really has become the gauntlet that it's the constant gotcha. They're trying to find some way to divide Republicans, to say this Republican's battling this Republican. That's a great story. Well, you know what? It's actually kind of boring now to say, I'm sorry, we don't agree on everything, but not all Republicans think alike. And that should be okay.
Next question.
Hello, good evening. As a legal immigrant that turned citizen here and a Trump supporter, I just had a question about his immigration, because that has been such a huge drive in his campaign for so long. Do you think that will be one of those issues where the Senate can meet halfway at B instead of A and C? Do you think that's one of the things where it's easy to be negotiating and he will back down, like he did with the whole Hillary thing and prosecuting?
Yes, I do. And I think part of it is what Chris and Amy were saying before. The Senate's a place where good bills go to die. And so the House, I know, they went the other way. So the House is going to pass something, and they'll be very passionate about immigration. The president-elect and now and future president will be engaged in this issue. The Senate will be the place where the minority voice is always heard, always. That's the only place in the federal government that the minority voice is always heard. So there'll be that bash in between, and my hope is that at the end of it, we don't walk away and say we're going to do nothing. That we actually engage and say, what progress can we make, and move on that.
And we also had a history there where we did work out a bill and had some significant support for that bill. So there's a lot of people that are very knowledgeable about the issues and had worked together on it before, and a lot of those same people are there. So that also bodes well. But I still think it's going to be hard to get this, given the rhetoric. But the facts are, and I have raised immigration reform myself, I do think that there could be a chance. But it would be to do it immediately. I'm trying to picture how that happens, given the campaign.
We got to get you out of here for an interview, I know, shortly.
Amy and I serve on the Judiciary Committee together. We did 3 weeks of markup on the bill. We had literally hundreds of amendments. And the terrific work of the bipartisan group of senators that pieced that together. I believe they're all still serving with us and made significant contributions. A lot of the architecture is already there. We do need a president who's willing to take risks, meet in the middle, and craft a bill that actually can gain support from both parties.
And just 20 seconds, just I totally agree with you as an observer of the political system. If President Trump makes conservatives happy with the Supreme Court pick and figures out a big win like reforming Obamacare, then he's going to have a lot of chits that he can, call in for an immigration reform. And I think it's totally possible.
Well, I absolutely think it's possible. I think at the end of the day, if the debate is about whether we're going to give citizenship to people that are here currently undocumented, I think the whole thing falls apart. But there's so many other areas of immigration reform that we can pull together, giving legal status.
You don't get immigration overhaul without dealing with that at some
point. Well, no. There's a difference between giving citizenship and giving some sort of legal status. And that will be a lot of the debate.
Okay, so you can.
You have to deal with the issue of the people that are here to get the
I completely agree, but you have to deal with all the basics on it first. But if people are willing to be able to say, let's find agreement on it, but that will be one of those A and C type issues, is to say, well, everyone demanded, we can't move on this unless you give everyone citizenship. It all falls apart.
Next question, and we've got to then get our senators out because they both have places to go.
I want to ask about campaign finance reform. I want to make clear, I was not a Trump supporter this election cycle, but one of the things that appealed to a lot of people who did support him was the idea that he couldn't be bought. And really, he self-funded a lot of his campaign in the primary in comparison to Jeb Bush, who had $100 million in corporate money. How does Donald Trump's campaign change campaign finance reform in the United States, even if things like Citizens United remain?
It doesn't. Yeah, okay. I don't. I mean, he has not made that a major topic. He's made Drain the Swamp a major theme, right, and mostly focused on lobbyists and those issues, and I think there's some support on the Democratic side for some of that, but he is not.
He's a unique character. He's like lightning in a bottle. I just think he's a unique character.
Yeah, I think he spent a third of what Hillary Clinton spent.
Yeah.
But that all being said, he has not talked about putting a justice in that wants to change Citizens United, or a constitutional amendment to change Citizens United, which to me is the way you put the control of these campaigns back in the hands of the candidates themselves and thus the citizens.
I am so sorry that we can't take more of your questions, but maybe there'll be a chance for you to mingle and mix with, I know you're going to hang around for a few minutes. I don't know.
Or maybe there'd be a chance to be able to come intern in one of our offices in the days, and we'll get even more time for you.
Would you like that? Anybody interested in interning in any offices here? So, all right, so we'll take cards. But let me ask each of you, through this conversation, which has been built around what Trump means and what it governs, to do 10 or 20 seconds on what young people here should be watching for and thinking about as they experience and learn Washington.
Well, I think that they should be looking at, first of all, getting involved yourself. The last thing for those people that were disappointed, I'll speak to them, at the election results, the last thing would be to just put your head under the covers and say, I can't believe this happened, I'm not going to be part of this. We need you as watchdogs, we need you urging us to action, and we need people to volunteer and stay involved in the system. And one of my most heartening things is that I thought maybe people would be like that. They haven't been like that at all. They're active, they're out there, they want to talk about issues. They've been coming up to me in diners and airports more than they've ever done before. They may have different political views, but they're not uninterested. So I think that is what you have to do as young people.
Yeah, real quick, I would say a couple of things. One is be more interested in policy than you are in politics. There are a lot of people that are fascinated with the campaigns. That's the job interview. Okay, be more interested in the job than the job interview. That will help a tremendous amount. On a personal level, let me say twofold. One is I see some of you that are concerned, afraid, whatever it may be. I would tell you in my state, in Oklahoma, 8 years ago when President Obama was elected, I had people that were running up to me going, oh my gosh, he's going to shut down this industry and shut down this industry. I'm afraid for my job, for my family, what's going to happen. There were conservatives that were afraid the other direction. You know what? It's still America. And we're going to work this out. And so I wouldn't panic about it. And the final thing I would say is, if you're a person of faith, live your faith. That is one of the most deepest, that is the deepest part of who we are. And for individuals that don't have a faith, you can still be a great American and not be a person of faith. But for people that have faith, live that out. Because that is the stabilizing force for most individuals in their own personal life.
So first, let me suggest you look to these two as role models. Senator Lankford has an article he wrote with Senator Scott about finding our way towards each other across racial divides that I think is well worth reading and reflects just how thoughtful he is. Senator Klobuchar was just recognized by a different school, the Medill School of Journalism, for literally being the leading senator in taking bipartisan bills and getting them signed into law. So we've got two great examples here of folks who make a difference. If I could offer just some closing advice, it's make a difference. Be willing to be engaged. Learn from people who are different from you. Live your faith and make a difference in the world, because then you'll find things that really matter to you. And we have to have an engaged, passionate electorate, or democracy isn't going to work. This is going to be a rough couple of years for us as we try and find a new accommodation with a new president. But it's still America. The lights are still on. It still works as a democracy. But the media, our elections, our governance, and our sense of community depend on you. So thank you for investing the time this evening, and I hope we've offered some encouragement.
Wow. Boy, I don't want to follow that. I will just say, I want to kind of end where I started, which is that, you know, the systems may be frustrating and broken, but it always, and I say this to people, and I have for the 2 decades I've covered Washington, and especially Congress, to a person, these individuals come to Washington and run not because of the power or the glamour, and because it's not easy, but because they want to get stuff done, and because they believe in the ideas and the ideals that drove them to public service. And, you know, just be optimistic about it, because it's real. You've seen it tonight.
And fight for what you believe in.
Yeah.
You know, fight for what you believe in. Raise your voice. make a difference. That's why you came to GW. That's why you came here this evening. Your voices are heard. I wanted us to have this conversation. I'm so sorry that we've run a little over, but it's been worth every second of it. And part of this is the media issue. We hear the same voices saying the same things, and what people don't get a chance to hear is individuals. There are relationships. You're not marching in lockstep behind Donald Trump. You didn't march in lockstep necessarily behind Obama, though close. But it's important for people to realize that the men and the women who work in these jobs are three-dimensional human beings.
Absolutely.
And they bring more than the sound bites that we often see to those jobs. And that, I think, is one of the dangers that we saw in this campaign. Mm-hmm. But this last campaign was ideologized and dumbed down and turned into simplistic sound bites. And yes, America rose up and said, burn the house down. And so now we burned the house down, and we'll start again, presumably, or at least it's on fire someplace. But there's a lot of work to do, and it isn't easy, and it isn't a straight line. And I think that's the lesson that we take from this. This doesn't end, it just takes a different shape. Guys, thank you all very much. Would you join me in thanking these wonderful panelists? I hope you enjoyed this, and have a good evening.
Thanks.
I hope that was okay.
Follow the transition of government on C-SPAN as Donald Trump becomes the 45th President of the United States and Republicans maintain control of the U.S. House and Senate. We'll take you to key events as they happen without interruption. Watch live on C-SPAN.